Hi everyone. So today we're going to go over the China and Japan review. This is called a review because you should have read this from your textbook. I just want to kind of reiterate from here on in the last time period, 1900 to the present, there is a lot of information. And so it's very important at this point till we get to the end of our units that you really are doing your reading and doing your own homework, because things like this we're just going to go over for just a few minutes because there's just not time for us to delve really deep into each particular topic. So if you haven't read about it, it's going to be hard and not make a lot of sense. All right, so we're going to start with China. So in the last time period, 1750 to 1900, you learned all about the Qing dynasty and a lot of what led to their downfall. So if you want to, you could pause the video and just discuss real quick what are some of the things that led to the downfall of China. And I believe you did the autopsy on the Qing dynasty, so you should have a good idea about that. So after the Qing dynasty fell, the first question is, who took over? So China pretty much descended into chaos in a lot of cases. Regional warlords, like whoever had a strong military to seize territory and power, pretty much ruled all different parts of China. And so the Qing dynasty was the last dynasty ever in China. When it fell, China had no strong central government. This leads directly to the May 4th movement. So the May 4th movement was organized by students and intellectuals, and it's just widespread protests. What they really want is a new modern government for China. So they feel like even though the Qing dynasty is gone, the new government isn't really stepping up to the plate and accomplishing anything. They feel like the traditions, like Confucianism, is just doesn't have a place in the modern world necessarily anymore. Okay, so what they really want is a liberal democracy, which is like a democracy like we have. Okay, where people have representation, people can actively participate in the political system. That's what they're wanting. Now, this leads to the rise of two different groups in China, which you have in your paper, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. So the Nationalist Party, the initial leader is Sun Yat-sen, who you see here. And then the leader who comes after him is Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek is going to be the leader throughout like the 1930s and into World War II. So the major Nationalist Party, their goals, they want to establish a new central government for China. And another thing for your purposes to know is that they're very much against the rise of communism in China. So Chiang Kai-shek, for example, spent a tremendous amount of energy fighting off the communist threat. All right, so Mao Zedong is pictured on the far right, so that he looks probably different than if you've seen images of him anytime, because this is him when he's a young revolutionary leader before he becomes the actual leader of China. All right, so Mao Zedong, his goal is to establish a communist state in China. Now, one thing I would say about that you might want to add is he believes in a communist state led by the peasants. So this is different than like Karl Marx's theory, where he said the factory workers are going to rise up and stage a revolution and overthrow the government and establish a communist state. Why doesn't that work in China? Remember, they don't have really a lot of factories. Like, they're not super industrialized at this time. So they're still very much rural and agricultural. And so Mao Zedong sees the leaders of the revolution as the peasants. So that's just one thing you might want to add. So like I said, the Nationalist Party, especially under Chiang Kai-shek, are very, very anti-communist. And so he spends a lot of military energy going after the communists and trying to find them, kill them, and just wipe out that threat. And so the Long March, it took place in the 1930s, and it's the escape of the communists from persecution by the Nationalist Party. So basically they had like they were kind of split. You can see the yellow and then the red area. And so from the southern portion, they were under heavy persecution by the Nationalist Party. And so they took this march, thousands of miles, where like tons of people starved to death, froze to death, etc., through China to the northern base of the Communist Party in the mountains. And basically, it was sort of like if they hadn't done that, they may have just kind of been wiped out and ended. And so this allowed them to regroup as one organization and plan what they were going to do next. And we'll learn later, right after World War II, what happens in China and the Communist Revolution in China when Mao actually takes power. But it's important to note that these changes are going on within China, because we are going to talk about this when we get to World War II. You're going to have to know what's going on in China and Japan in the 20s and 30s and how that affects what happens during World War II. All right, so let's also talk about Japan real briefly and review some information from your reading. So let me back up even further. We last talked about Japan in the Meiji Restoration, and you might want to pause the video and review what the Meiji Restoration is. So during this time period, remember, Japan had defeated, in the early 1900s, defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan was expanding outward. One of the reasons that this was really significant to them is that, remember, they underwent a rapid industrialization under the Meiji Restoration. And also remember, meaning they built lots of factories. Remember, Japan is a very small nation without a lot of natural resources. And so they felt like in order to keep their factories going and really build up their economy, they needed more resources. And so that's one of the reasons they became an imperial power and started going out and conquering other territory. So you already learned, for example, that they took over Korea. Now on your paper, it says the Japanese democracy was having problems. So one thing that's not even really a problem in this time period, like a new problem, but that you should already know, is that they were not very representative. So even though Japan had this new government under the Meiji Restoration, I think something like 5% of people were eligible to vote. So it was not a democracy, really. It was just a democracy on paper. Another thing is that the military reported only to the emperor. So the emperor had a lot of power to use the military however he saw fit. And eventually, a military takeover occurred in Japan. Why did this occur? Well, one of the things that you're going to learn about, if you haven't already, is the Great Depression. I don't know, I can't remember if you've already done that or you're doing that the next class period. But the Great Depression and the economic issues and turmoil caused a lot of people throughout the world to question their governments. And so this occurred in Japan as well. So people kind of think, well, there's unemployment, we're suffering, our government's not doing a good job, we need a new government. And that happened throughout the world in response to the Great Depression. That's how people like Hitler came to power, or one of the ways. Okay, so it led people to question the government. And so the government became military focused, where generals became the leaders of the government. All right, now onto this map. You can see here Japan and then an arrow leading to Manchuria. So Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. They did this, like I said before, to get natural resources. So they wanted iron and coal resources from Manchuria. This is part of China. This action was condemned by the League of Nations, but you might remember from World War I that the League of Nations was very weak. So the League of Nations didn't have any enforcement power. They could say, stop, you can't do that. But if you do it anyway, nobody could do anything to stop you. And so what did Japan do when this was condemned? They said, that's fine, we're going to leave the League of Nations. And they disregarded what they said. And so this invasion into Chinese territory by Japan led to the Sino-Japanese War, 1937 to the end of World War II in 1945. So what happened? Basically, they're invading and taking over territory in China. There's a lot of events that we're not going to get into, but for example, in this image, the Japanese were especially brutal and harsh towards the Chinese people. Like there were a lot of brutal executions of the Chinese. They were pretty ruthless in their conquest. So that is a quick review of China and Japan from the reading. Again, this is really important, even though we're not spending a lot of time on it, to help you understand when we get to the events of World War II and when we talk about communism in China. So next, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about some more review information from your chapter. Again, it's very important that you're doing your reading, especially in this time period, 1900 to present, because there's so much to cover that we are not going to have a lot of time to talk about in class, like some of the things here. All right, so I'm just going to give you a little quick review of the reading that gives a good lead in to the Great Depression and what's going on there. So the 1920s, throughout the Western world especially, were known as the Roaring Twenties. This is a time of general economic prosperity. So we see things like, just new things coming about. So we see jazz as a musical style, below that Cubism, different fashions, different dances, the widespread consumerism. We see an assembly line, building automobiles, which people could afford in a lot of places for the first time. So really, there's just like an economic boom after World War I. Now, one of the things that President Wilson, you remember, had really wanted out of the Paris Peace Settlement was the creation of the League of Nations. And it was created, all right? But remember, in the United States, our Congress has to ratify any treaty that our nation becomes involved in. And the United States never ratified the treaty. And so the United States never joined the League of Nations, even though we were the ones that actually proposed it. And without the United States, plus the problems of the League of Nations that they had no enforcement power, the League of Nations was not very effective in preventing any different tensions and conflicts that arose. And so if you want to, you could spend a second and discuss this political cartoon as a class. So you also probably remember that the Treaty of Versailles was very, very harsh in its treatment of Germany. They had to pay huge reparations to countries like Great Britain and France, which they could not afford to pay. The 1920s government in Germany is called the Weimar Republic. So remember, they had an authoritarian government which was overthrown, and they established this new government, but it had a tremendous amount of economic problems because Germany was really crippled under the Treaty of Versailles and just trying to rebuild their economy after the war. They had hyperinflation, which these images show. So hyperinflation means that their money was basically worthless. Like if you look in the picture on the top right, you can see a woman who's brought a whole basket of money to buy one head of lettuce, which I don't know if any of you do shopping for that kind of thing, but a head of lettuce is like $1 at H-E-B. All right, so their money became almost worthless. You see a woman using it to burn in her stove, to power her stove, rather than actually using it to buy stuff. You see kids playing with stacks of money as blocks. So Germany basically suffered really tremendous economic hardship. This is just some more about that. So you can see the value of the Deutschmark, which is their currency, and the cost of a loaf of bread in 1918, less than 1 mark. 1923, just a few years later, 200 billion marks. So again, Germany was crippled under the debt that they had to other countries, but also in just trying to actually rebuild their country, like all the countries of Europe who were involved in World War I were trying to do in the 1920s. Now, these economic issues lead directly into the rise of fascism, and you're going to learn more about this when you study totalitarianism, which is either today or tomorrow in class. But fascism is a new political philosophy that developed in the 1920s with the leader Mussolini, who you see here, and Mussolini was the leader of Italy. So here are some key beliefs. Loyalty to the state above all else. So fascist leaders say, I'm going to fix all your problems, but in order to do that, you need to give total control to the state. Like the government needs to be powerful in order to achieve these things. So you're going to have to sacrifice some of your rights, but you're going to get good things in the end, is what they promised. Loyalty and obedience to strong leader. Again, the same thing. The leader needs a tremendous amount of power to be able to fix these economic problems that they're experiencing and make things happen. And they combine nationalism with strong authority, attracted followers in countries humiliated by World War I. So The nationalism part would be saying like, we're going to restore the power and greatness of our country. And so the government, again, needs power in order to achieve those things. So in countries like Italy and Germany, Italy didn't get much out of the peace settlement. Germany was definitely humiliated in the war. These beliefs attracted a following. So let's talk about the Great Depression. Just depression in general, what that word means, it's a period of low economic activity. So there's several causes of the Great Depression. One is overproduction of products. And you may want to kind of stick with my explanation and not just start writing stuff down, or it could be kind of confusing if you just copy stuff off the slides. So during World War I, there were a lot of resources, like factories were diverted from producing consumer products to producing stuff for the military. And so after World War I, people thought, oh, this is great. We're going to be able to produce products again and have lots of stuff to buy. This led to overproduction. So they really overestimated how much to produce, okay? And so companies had all these products, all this inventory, which cost money, that they weren't selling. And so to be able to make ends meet, they started laying off workers. Now, when you lay off a worker, that can have an effect on the economy as well, because that person no longer has money to spend in the economy, all right? So that's an issue, because when people get laid off and they're no longer shopping as much, these businesses that already have too many products, now they have even more because they're laying off people and those people are not spending money. The same thing happened in farming. So farmers now start ramping up production again. The men are home from war. They start growing tons and tons of crops, more than they're able to sell. And so the same thing happens. All right. At the same time, there's increased competition in world markets. People are trading more. And so governments don't know what to do. What governments at this time thought was a good solution is to put tariffs on imports. So that is supposed to make things from another country more expensive so that people in your country buy things that are made domestically, and it's supposed to help domestic business. In this case, it definitely made things worse, that people were not trading with each other. Why were people overproducing in the first place? I think I pretty much went over that. They miscalculated how much to produce after the war when they were ramping up production. So another problem with the Great Depression leading up to it is that governments didn't have a really great knowledge of economics at this time. So they were not sure what to do. They put protectionist tariffs in place, like I talked about. Governments cut spending, which in a lot of cases is the opposite of what our government does today. And this caused many people to turn to more radical ideas to solve problems. So I talked about that previously with fascism. Keep that in mind. This is I would say the number one thing to know about the Great Depression for world history. It causes people to question their governments because people are suffering. They don't have jobs. They don't have enough to eat, things like that. They feel like their government isn't fixing it, and so they're more willing to listen to someone who's more radical. So really keep that in mind as you go forward. All right, John Maynard Keynes is an economist who said government should spend money, do the opposite of what they traditionally did, and put people to work instead of cutting spending. So he said the only way the economy is going to get going is if people have money to go out and buy stuff from businesses. And all these people have been laid off. They don't have money and they're not shopping anywhere. And so he said the government should spend money, put people to work, even if the government has to go into some debt. Because once people have jobs, they'll go out and buy stuff, and that will fix a lot of the economic issues. So this was a controversial idea at the time, but some places like the United States and Germany adopted programs similar to these ideas. Now, this is something that our government does today, like the part where they run a deficit. That was something that governments thought was not a good idea, which you can have your own opinions on whether it's a good idea or not. But this is a new idea that governments should spend when the economy is not doing well. They just hadn't really been open to that before. All right, and then the final straw that really caused the Great Depression is the stock market crash in the United States. So in summer 1929, investors began selling stocks and prices began to drop. So let's talk about how that occurred and what actually happened. Okay, so it's first important to note that the stock market at this time was very much unregulated compared to today. So today, for example, there are like precautions built into the stock market to where if stock prices like dramatically start crashing, the computers will just like shut down the whole system to try to prevent issues like this prevent issues like this again. So the other issue here is that people at this time bought stocks on margin. So they paid only a fraction of the true price. So follow this example along with me. You want to buy 100 shares of stock. They're valued at $10, so you should have to pay $1,000. If you buy on margin, it's sort of like you're betting that the stock is going to go up. Because say you maybe put down $300 and you still owe $700 to the stockbroker. Okay, now you have to keep in mind in the roaring 20s, the stock market had just been booming. And so people thought, this is just going to keep going up forever. You know, it's going to be great. We're going to make money. It's not going to be a problem. Now, when the crash occurred and you can't pay back your $700 to the stockbroker, he, in a lot of cases, had loans to run his business from a bank, and now he can't pay that back to the bank. And so the effect of that, a lot of banks went out of business because they didn't have enough money. People weren't repaying their loans. And so they didn't have enough money to even pay back the people who wanted to take their money out of the bank. And this is called a run on a bank, like we see in the image here, where all these people rushed to the bank to withdraw their money out of their accounts. And because people hadn't paid back their loans, the bank didn't have money and the banks went out of business. One of the things that you may have, if you've ever been in a bank or you hear it on like advertisements, I would say FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where today, as a result of the Great Depression, the government guarantees your deposits in a bank up to a certain amount, that if that bank goes out of business, the government will pay you back. So that's just one of the things that came out of the Great Depression in the United States. So the immediate response is people stopped investing. World industrial production fell, which we talked about how that caused people to be laid off, which reduced demand for products even more. So it's kind of like a downward spiral. The USA, after World War I, had lent a bunch of money to people in Europe because the economy was booming in the USA and the Europeans were trying to rebuild. All of a sudden now, the people in the U.S. say, we need our money, our loans paid back right away. We need our money. And so that money was withdrawn from Europe. That hurt Europe. And the Depression spread worldwide. And so you're going to do an activity where you look at how the Depression impacted different areas of the world. Effects on people, huge unemployment. So in the U.S., unemployment jumped from 3 to 25%, so a quarter of all people. Industrial production dropped, global trade slowed, and people began to look to governments for solutions. So again, like I said, that's one of the most important things to keep in mind here, is that people in any time of crisis question their government. All right, so it caused people in some countries to look to more radical ideas because they felt like our current system is not working. We need something different.